If you walked into the company you built with your own blood and found another woman sitting at your desk, wearing your wedding ring and signing your name, would you call the police? Or would you realize the police are already on her payroll? My name is Janet, and for 30 years, I was the chief architect of Thorn Aegis, the woman who designed the most impenetrable digital vault in the corporate world, a vault that has now been used to lock me out of my own life. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. And drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. The glass doors of the Thorn Aegis headquarters didn't slide open as I approached. They remained sealed, the biometric scanner blinking a cold, defiant red as it rejected the pulse print I had programmed into its core. I stood there, a 60-year-old woman in a sharp black suit, watching my own reflection in the tinted glass and realizing that the system was no longer listening to its creator. When I reached the reception desk, the young woman there looked at me with a polite, clinical vacancy that was more terrifying than a scream. She didn't see the founder of the firm, she saw a trespasser. When I demanded to see my husband, Julian, she informed me with a frozen smile that Mr. Thorne was currently in a closed-door meeting with his wife, Janet. The sound of my own name being used to describe someone else felt like a physical blow to my chest, a surgical strike intended to decapitate my identity. I looked up at the digital directory in the lobby and my heart turned to ice. My name had been scrubbed from the board of directors, my stock options had been liquidated, and my private office had been reassigned to a consultant who shared my exact likeness. I pulled out my phone, but the screen was a dead black void, remotely wiped by the very security protocols I had designed to protect the company from industrial espionage. I watched the elevator doors open, and for a split second, I saw Julian walking toward the garage, his arm draped around a woman who moved with my grace and wore my favorite silk scarf. He didn't look at me. He looked through me as if I were a ghost already haunting the hallways of my own legacy. I realized in that moment that this wasn't a mistake, it was an erasure. Julian hadn't just replaced me in the boardroom. He had replaced me in the world. But as I walked back out into the rain, my mind began to hum with a cold, precise rhythm. They think they have uninstalled me, but they forgot that I am the one who wrote the encryption keys for every door in this building. And I know exactly how to trigger a system-wide collapse. I drove to the estate in a silence so absolute it felt like the world had been muted. My hands gripping the steering wheel with a mechanical rigidity as I navigated the winding roads that led to the sanctuary Julian and I had built over 3 decades of shared ambition. The wrought iron gates of our home, usually programmed to recognize the RFID chip in my vehicle from 50 yards away, remained motionless, their heavy black bars forming a physical manifestation of the digital wall I had encountered at the office. I didn't reach for the intercom. I knew the voice on the other end would be a script I hadn't authorized, so I used the manual override code hidden beneath the stone pillar, a secret fail-safe I had installed for an emergency I never dreamed would involve my own husband. As the gates groaned open, I felt a shudder of cold, stunned realization. The gravel driveway was immaculate, the fountains were flowing, and the lights in the foyer were glowing with a warmth that felt like a mockery of the ice forming in my marrow. I stepped through the front door, expecting the security system to chime its usual "Welcome home, Janet," but the house remained silent, its smart environment recalibrated to a frequency that no longer registered my presence. I walked toward the master study, the scent of Julian's expensive tobacco and the familiar sandalwood of my own perfume swirling together in an olfactory lie that made my stomach turn. I found him sitting by the fireplace, 2 glasses of vintage Bordeaux resting on the table, as if he were waiting for a ghost to arrive for dinner. When he looked up, there was no shock, no flicker of guilt, and no recognition, only a polite, chillingly distant curiosity that one might show to a trespassing stranger. He stood up, his posture elegant and his expression a mask of silver-haired perfection, and asked me how I had bypassed the perimeter security. I didn't scream, I didn't throw the glass, I simply asked him who was upstairs in our bed. He leaned back, the firelight catching the gold of his wedding band, the twin to the one currently missing from my own finger, and told me with a level, precise cadence that his wife, Janet, was currently resting after a long day at the firm. The sheer audacity of his gaslighting was breathtaking, a psychological siege designed to make me question the very ground I stood on. He spoke about me in the third person, describing a woman who was stable, loyal, and present, effectively erasing the woman standing 3 feet in front of him. I realized then that Julian hadn't just hired a double. He had curated a reality where I was the anomaly, a glitch in a perfect domestic portrait. He reached for his phone, and I knew he wasn't calling the police. He was calling the security team that had neutralized me at the office, the cleanup crew for a life he had decided to liquidate. I looked at the family photos on the mantle, and my heart stopped. Every image had been digitally altered, the woman in the frames looking enough like me to pass at a distance, but possessing a vacant, porcelain beauty that was entirely foreign. I wasn't just being replaced, I was being edited out of history. As the sound of tires on the gravel signaled the arrival of his men, I backed toward the shadows of the hallway, my mind already bypassing the home's local network to unlock the basement service tunnel. Julian thought he was finishing a merger, but he was actually declaring war on the only person who knew the structural weaknesses of his entire life. And as I vanished into the dark, I vowed that by the time I was finished, there wouldn't be a single piece of the Thorne legacy left for him to inherit. The basement service tunnel was a cold, subterranean artery I had designed into the estate's blueprint as a tactical afterthought. A place of damp concrete and humming fiber optic cables that now felt like the only honest space left in my world. I moved through the shadows with a predatory precision, my breath shallow and controlled, as the heavy boots of Julian's security detail thudded against the floorboards directly above my head, a rhythmic reminder that my sanctuary had officially become a hunting ground. I didn't stop until I reached a nondescript steel panel behind the wine cellar, a door that required a sequence of physical pressure points rather than a digital scan, leading into a 10 by 10 subterranean room that existed on no official floor plan. This was my black site, a disconnected node where I kept the analog backups of the Thorne Aegis Core protocols and a vintage workstation that Julian's high-tech sweeps would never detect. I sat in the flickering light of a single monitor, my face a mask of frozen, crystalline resolve as I watched the internal security feed of my own home. I saw Julian standing in the foyer, calmly directing his men to search the grounds for the intruder, while the woman wearing my face stood at the top of the stairs, her expression as blank and polished as a fresh tombstone. The sight of her, the replacement, triggered a surge of cold fury that I channeled into the keyboard, my fingers moving with a mechanical speed that felt like a symphony of vengeance. I didn't start by attacking the main servers. That would be too loud, too desperate. Instead, I began to wake up the ghost scripts I had buried in the company's infrastructure a decade ago, dormant lines of code designed to act as a dead man's switch if the board ever turned against me. I watched as the encrypted files of Julian's private offshore accounts began to trickle onto my screen, each line of data, a jagged piece of evidence revealing a decade of systematic embezzlement and identity theft. He had been planning this liquidation for years, slowly moving the architecture of my life into a blind trust controlled by a woman who didn't exist until 6 months ago. The stunned realization that the man I had built a legacy with had been measuring my coffin while we shared our morning coffee didn't break me. It sharpened me into a blade. I began to reroute the company's internal communication pings, creating a digital loop that would make Julian's security team chase shadows while I prepared to breach the Thorne Aegis main vault from the inside out. I looked at the black and white feed of Julian pouring a drink, his movements relaxed and victorious, and I felt a dark, purposeful satisfaction. He thinks he has deleted the architect, but he has only succeeded in removing the safety constraints I used to protect him from his own greed. I am no longer operating within the laws of the company or the country. I am the ghost in the wiring, the silent variable that is about to turn his perfect, sanitized reality into a catastrophic system failure, and by the time the sun rises, the name Thorne will be the most toxic asset in the world. The boardroom of Thorne Aegis was a cathedral of glass and ego, a place where I had once commanded the silence of the most powerful men in the industry. And now it was the stage for a performance I intended to dismantle with surgical, cold-blooded efficiency. From my subterranean refuge, I bypassed the building's external firewalls and burrowed into the internal video conferencing hub. Watching through a hidden pinhole lens as the board members settled into their leather chairs for an emergency session Julian had called to finalize my permanent retirement. They sat there with their expensive watches and their rehearsed expressions of concern, nodding along as Julian presented a forged medical report detailing my supposed psychological collapse, a a document that characterized my 30 years of genius as a slow-motion breakdown. The woman playing my part sat in the shadows at the back of the room, a silent porcelain specter of compliance that the board accepted because she was easier to manage than the original. I waited until Julian reached the climax of his lie, the moment he moved to authorize the transfer of my remaining voting shares into his private trust, and then I struck with the precision of a lightning bolt hitting a conductor. Every screen in the room, from the massive wall-mounted monitors to the individual tablets on the mahogany table, flickered once and then died, replaced by a scrolling, high-definition manifest of every bribe, every kickback, and every offshore wire transfer Julian had ever authorized to buy their loyalty. The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it vanished. I watched through the camera as the board members' faces transitioned from smug indifference to a stunned, paralyzed terror, their own private communications and hidden subledgers appearing in bright, clinical white against the black screens. I didn't use a voice distorter. I used my own voice, amplified through the hidden emergency speakers I had installed for a building-wide crisis, and I spoke their crimes back to them with a rhythmic, mechanical cadence that left no room for denial. I didn't call them traitors, I called them data points in a failed system. I informed them that at that exact microsecond, the same documents were being uploaded to a distributed ledger that no government or corporation could delete, a digital death sentence that would be triggered the moment they voted to finalize Julian's coup. The sight of Julian standing at the head of the table, his face draining of color until he looked as hollow as the lie he was selling, was a moment of pure cinematic justice. He tried to shout for security, but I had already locked the boardroom doors and initiated a Protocol Zero lockdown, turning their temple of power into a high-security holding cell. The woman at the back of the room finally looked at the camera, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip, revealing the flickering eyes of a mercenary who realized the ship was sinking. I wasn't just exposing Julian. I was incinerating the entire network that had allowed him to think I was replaceable. I watched the chaos unfold in high-definition silence, a ghost architect overseeing the controlled demolition of her own creation, and I realized that while they had stolen my name, they had never understood my power. I am the system, I am the vault, and I am the one who decides when the lights go out forever. The hunt has changed from a corporate takeover to a desperate game of shadows, and for the first time in 30 years, I am the one being followed through the very halls I designed to be a fortress of privacy. My replacement, the woman Julian hired to wear my face and steal my life, is no longer playing the part of a graceful wife. She has shed her porcelain mask and revealed the cold, hungry eyes of a professional cleaner. From my hidden monitoring station, I watched her through the infrared sensors as she moved through the dark corridors of Thorn Aegis, her movements too sharp, too practiced, and too lethal to belong to anyone but a mercenary. She was not looking for a wife, she was looking for a target that needed to be permanently deleted before the board's panic turned into a full confession. I sat in the darkness, my face a mask of frozen, stunned resolve, watching her use a high-frequency scanner to pulse the walls, trying to find the acoustic signature of my hidden refuge. She thinks she knows this building because she studied the blueprints Julian gave her, but she doesn't understand that blueprints only show the bones, not the soul. I waited until she was exactly 10 feet from the wine cellar's hidden door, her hand reaching for a weapon she had hidden under her designer coat, and then I spoke to her through the localized intercom, my voice a flat, surgical whisper that seemed to come from the air itself. I didn't threaten her, I simply told her the truth, that Julian had already authorized a cleanup protocol for her the moment I was found, a secondary layer of betrayal that would ensure she never lived to collect her payment. I watched her pause, a flicker of doubt crossing that familiar face, a moment of human hesitation that proved she was just another piece of hardware in Julian's failing machine. She tried to override the door, but I reversed the polarity of the magnetic locks, the sound of the steel bolts slamming home echoing like a gunshot in the narrow hallway. I wasn't just trapping her. I was showing her that in this house, I am the only god that matters. The precision of her fear was beautiful to behold as I flooded the hallway with a thick, harmless white fog, erasing her vision and leaving her stumbling in a world of my making. She screamed for Julian, but Julian was currently miles away, trying to stop the bleeding of his bank accounts, leaving his perfect replacement to rot in a basement she couldn't navigate. I realized then that the only thing more dangerous than a woman who has been erased is a woman who knows exactly how to erase you back. I reached for the master control, my fingers moving with a heavy, purposeful grace, and I began to reroute the facility's facial recognition software. By the time she found her way out, every camera in the city would see her not as Janet Thorne, but as an international fugitive. I am the ghost in the wiring, and as I watched her collapse against the cold concrete in a fit of powerless rage, I knew the counterstrike had only just begun. The time for hiding in the shadows of my own architecture has ended, and as I prepare for the final confrontation with Julian, I feel a cold, heavy stillness settle over my spirit like the first snow of a long winter. I stood in front of the mirrored wall in my secret room, watching the woman who looked back at me. She was not the polished executive the world knew, nor the broken victim Julian wanted me to be, but a person stripped down to her hardest, most lethal core. I didn't reach for a weapon of steel or lead. My weapons are the passwords, the private keys, and the devastating truths that I have carried in the vault of my mind for 30 years. I dressed in the black suit I wore the day we founded Thorn Aegis, a silent reminder that I was the foundation upon which he built his cathedral of lies. Outside, the world was beginning to scream as the data I leaked began to tear through the stock market, but inside this subterranean silence, I focused only on the mechanical rhythm of my own heart. I pulled up the security feed of our master bedroom and saw Julian sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, finally realizing that you cannot delete the person who programmed your entire world. He looked small, a man made of paper who had finally run out of ink. I didn't feel pity and I didn't feel joy. I felt only the stunned, precise clarity of a judge preparing to deliver a final sentence. I began the process of opening every door between my refuge and the master's suite, the sound of the magnetic locks clicking open echoing through the empty mansion like a countdown to a collision. I moved through the dark house, my footsteps silent on the marble, passing the empty frames and the digital ghosts of a life that had been a beautiful, curated fraud. When I reached the door to the bedroom, I didn't knock and I didn't hesitate. I walked into the light of the fireplace and watched the color drain from his face as he looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time in years. He didn't see a ghost and he didn't see a stranger. He saw the one person who knew exactly how much he had cost the world. I stood before him, my posture as rigid as a skyscraper and my eyes as cold as a deep-sea trench, waiting for the first lie to fall from his lips so I could burn it with the truth. The air in the room was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the static of a dying empire, and as he opened his mouth to speak, I realized that I wasn't just here to take my life back. I was here to make sure that by the time I walked out of this house, the name Julian Thorne would be nothing more than a ghost story told to people who think they can outsmart their own souls. The stage is set, the audience of cameras is watching from the walls, and now the architect is going to tear the house down with the builder still inside. The fire in the hearth crackled with a dry, hollow sound, casting long, jagged shadows across the room as I stood before Julian, the man I had loved, built for, and protected, only to be discarded like a redundant piece of code. He looked up at me, his eyes searching for a weakness, a flicker of the Janet who used to overlook his flaws, but he found only a mirror of his own cold ambition, polished to a lethal edge. "How much was I worth to you, Julian?" I asked, my voice a flat, surgical whisper that cut through the silence of the room like a blade through silk. I didn't wait for him to lie. I watched his throat move as he swallowed the excuses he had been rehearsing, his gaze darting to the phone on the nightstand that I had already rendered useless. He tried to stand, to reclaim the physical dominance he had used to keep me in his shadow, but he tripped over the weight of his own sudden insignificance. He told me that everything he did was for the company, that the replacement was a necessary evolution to keep the Thorne name untainted by my aging presence, his words falling between us like cold ash. I didn't scream and I didn't weep. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, analog drive containing the final authorization codes for the liquidation of every asset he claimed to own. I told him that while he was busy playing a game of faces, I was rewriting the ledger of his soul, and that at this very moment, the board of directors was being arrested on live television for the crimes I had uncovered. The stunned look of pure, primitive terror that washed over his face was the only payment I required for 30 years of silent labor. He pleaded with me, calling me by my name as if he hadn't just tried to erase it from the history books, promising me a return to the life we had before, but I looked at him with a stunned, precise clarity and realized that the man I loved had never actually existed. He was just a hollow vessel I had filled with my own genius, and now that I was withdrawing my light, there was nothing left but a shadow. I told him that the woman he hired to replace me was currently in the basement, trapped in a reality she couldn't control, and that by the time the authorities arrived, they would find two Janets, one who was a fraud and one who was a ghost. I stepped back into the shadows of the doorway, watching him collapse back onto the bed, a broken king in a kingdom of glass that was already shattering around him. I didn't need to strike him. The truth was doing the work for me, dismantling his ego piece by piece until he was nothing more than a data point in a failed experiment. I turned my back on the man and the life he had stolen, knowing that as the sirens began to wail in the distance, the architect was finally free of the building. And the building was finally ready to burn. The fire in the hearth crackled with a dry, hollow sound, casting long, jagged shadows across the room as I stood before Julian, the man I had loved, built for, and protected, only to be discarded like a redundant piece of code. He looked up at me, his eyes searching for a weakness, a flicker of the woman who used to overlook his flaws, but he found only a mirror of his own cold ambition, polished to a lethal edge. "How much was I worth to you, Julian?" I asked, my voice a flat, surgical whisper that cut through the silence of the room like a blade through silk. I didn't wait for him to lie. I watched his throat move as he swallowed the excuses he had been rehearsing, his gaze darting to the phone on the nightstand that I had already rendered useless. He tried to stand, to reclaim the physical dominance he had used to keep me in his shadow, but he tripped over the weight of his own sudden insignificance. He told me that everything he did was for the company, that the replacement woman was a necessary evolution to keep the Thorn name untainted, his words falling between us like cold ash. I didn't scream and I didn't weep. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out a small analog drive containing the final authorization codes for the liquidation of every asset he claimed to own. I told him that while he was busy playing a game of faces, I was rewriting the ledger of his soul, and that at this very moment, the board of directors was being arrested for the crimes I had uncovered. The stunned look of pure, primitive terror that washed over his face was the only payment I required for 30 years of silent labor. He pleaded with me, calling me by my name as if he hadn't just tried to erase it from the history books, promising me a return to the life we had before. But I looked at him with a stunned, precise clarity and realized that the man I loved had never actually existed. He was just a hollow vessel I had filled with my own genius, and now that I was withdrawing my light, there was nothing left but a shadow. I told him that the woman he hired to replace me was currently in the basement, trapped in a reality she couldn't control, and that by the time the authorities arrived, they would find two Janets, one who was a fraud and one who was a ghost. I stepped back into the shadows of the doorway, watching him collapse back onto the bed, a broken king in a kingdom of glass that was already shattering around him. I didn't need to strike him. The truth was doing the work for me, dismantling his ego piece by piece until he was nothing more than a data point in a failed experiment. I turned my back on the man and the life he had stolen, knowing that as the sirens began to wail in the distance, the architect was finally free of the building, and the building was finally ready to burn. I stood there watching him realize that he hadn't just lost a wife, he had lost the only person who knew how to keep his world from collapsing, and now, the collapse was the only thing left to witness. The sirens began as a low, distant hum, a mechanical chorus of justice that grew louder until the rhythmic blue and red lights began to dance across the expensive velvet curtains of the master suite. I watched Julian's face transform from a mask of arrogance to a landscape of total, stunned defeat. He looked at the window and then back at me, finally understanding that the walls I had built were no longer there to protect him, but to cage him. I didn't say a word as I turned and walked out of the room, my heels making a steady, purposeful sound on the hardwood that felt like the closing of a heavy book. I moved through the house with the ghost-like grace of someone who had already left this life behind, passing the high-tech security panels that I had silenced with a final, irreversible command. As I reached the grand staircase, I saw the first flashlights cutting through the darkness of the foyer, the authorities I had summoned with a single, untraceable data packet arriving to dismantle the Thorn legacy. I didn't run, I didn't hide. I walked through the service entrance I had designed for a moment exactly like this, stepping out into the cold night air just as the front doors were breached with a deafening crash. I stood in the shadows of the old oak trees at the edge of the property, watching as the man who tried to delete me was led out in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled and his dignity stripped away in the harsh glare of the spotlights. The woman who had been hired to wear my face was brought out next, her eyes wide with a frantic animal terror as she realized the Janet Thorne identity was now a legal death trap she couldn't escape. I felt no joy in the sight, only a profound, crystalline sense of completion. I had built an empire, watched it turn into a monster, and then I had taken it apart with the same precision I used to create it. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the encrypted key that held the last of the company's secrets, and dropped it into the deep, dark water of the garden well, listening for the small, final splash that signaled the end of my life as an architect. The world would wake up tomorrow to headlines about the fall of a giant, but they would find no trace of the woman who pulled the internal lever. I walked toward the unmarked car I had waiting at the end of the lane, leaving the burning lights of the estate behind me, a woman without a name, without a shadow, and finally without a master. The Thorn era was over, but as I looked at my hands in the dim light of the dashboard, I realized they were steady, cold, and ready to design something new. This time, a life that no one could ever hope to uninstall. The woman named Janet Thorne died the moment those sirens faded into the night, and in her place emerged a shadow with no history, no fingerprints, and a mind that functioned like a cold, silent engine of retribution. I sat in a dimly lit motel room 300 miles away, the air smelling of cheap bleach and old secrets, staring at a laptop screen that was the only tether left to my former existence. I had already scrubbed my digital footprint from every public server, replacing my biometric data with a string of corrupted code that would trigger a system crash for anyone brave enough to search for me. I looked at the new passport on the table, a different name, a different life, but the same sharp, calculating eyes reflecting in the glass. I knew that Julian, despite his greed, lacked the technical brilliance to orchestrate a global erasure on his own. He was merely a puppet, and I was now hunting the hands that held his strings. My fingers danced across the keys with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, bypassing the layers of shell companies and offshore trusts that Julian thought were invisible. I wasn't just looking for money. I was looking for the signature of a specific type of darkness, a corporate backing that specialized in the liquidation of inconvenient founders. I found it buried in a series of encrypted pings coming from a private server in a city I had never visited, a digital trail that led straight to the doorsteps of our biggest competitor, the very people Julian had sworn to destroy. The stunned realization that my husband hadn't just replaced me, but had sold the soul of our company to our enemies for a seat at a table that didn't exist, was a bitter pill that I swallowed without a sound. I watched as the data began to assemble into a map of a much larger conspiracy, a web of industrial espionage that stretched far beyond the walls of Thorn Aegis. They thought they were dealing with a retired executive, a woman who would go quietly into the night, but they forgot that I am the architect who knows where every back door and every structural flaw is hidden. I began to plant the first of my own digital parasites into their network, silent watchers that would feed me their every move while I remained a ghost in their machine. I felt a cold, crystalline focus settle over me as I realized that the fight was no longer about a marriage or a house. It was about the total destruction of a system that believed human lives were just lines of code to be deleted. I closed the laptop, the glow of the screen lingering in my eyes like a promise, and stepped out onto the balcony of the motel, watching the sun rise over a world that had no idea I was coming for it. I am the ghost architect, and I have just started building the gallows for the men who thought they could own my mind. I arrived in the city under a sky the color of bruised steel, moving through the crowded terminal like a silent predator in a field of unsuspecting prey. The headquarters of Vesper Global stood as a jagged monolith of glass and arrogance, towering over the skyline as a physical reminder of the people who paid for my erasure. To the world, I was a ghost, but to the censors of this building, I was a series of ghost scripts I had written years ago while consulting on their very own security protocols. I checked into a modest hotel across the street, a place where the curtains were thick enough to hide the glow of my monitors and the cold, precise tools of my new trade. I didn't spend my time weeping over the past. I spent it mapping the patrol routes of the security guards and the refresh rates of the facial recognition cameras that guarded the executive floors. I watched through a pair of high-powered binoculars as the men who had funded Julian's betrayal walked in and out of those doors, their faces smug and their posture heavy with the weight of stolen power. They thought their fortress was impenetrable because they had bought the best technology money could buy, but they forgot that technology is only as strong as the person who understands its deepest flaws. I spent the night coding a localized EMP burst, a surgical strike that would black out a single corridor for exactly 60 seconds, just enough time for a woman who knows the layout of the ventilation shafts to become a permanent part of the interior. I felt a stunned, mechanical calm as I dyed my hair a sharp, clinical silver and fitted myself into a technician's uniform I had intercepted from a local delivery service. I wasn't just Janet Thorne anymore. I was a glitch in their reality, a phantom variable that was about to walk through their front door and begin the slow process of rotting their empire from the inside out. I looked at the building one last time before descending into the street, its lights flickering like the heartbeat of a dying beast. They think they are the masters of the digital world, but they are about to learn that when you steal an architect's life, she doesn't just come back for her name. She comes back to ensure that not one stone is left standing upon another. I stepped into the lobby, my heart beating with the steady, rhythmic cadence of a ticking clock, and as the scanner swept over my face, I felt the familiar, cold rush of the hunt beginning in earnest. The air inside the executive inner sanctum of Vesper Global was thin and tasted of expensive filtration and cold, calculated secrets. I moved through the shadows of the 80th floor with a rhythmic, mechanical grace, my technicians' uniform acting as a cloak of invisibility against the workers who looked but never truly saw me. I reached the master server room, the black heart of the conspiracy, and used a pulse generator to bypass the triple encrypted lock I had once helped their lead engineer conceptualize during a trade summit years ago. The room hummed with a low-frequency vibration that vibrated in my teeth, a digital choir of stolen lives and hijacked data. I slid my customized bypass drive into the primary port, and for a moment, the world felt like it had stopped spinning as the true extent of their depravity began to scroll across my screen in clinical white text. It wasn't just my company they had targeted. Julian was merely one of a dozen useful idiots they had manipulated into betraying their partners to consolidate a monopoly over the world's private security data. I watched, stunned and precise in my horror, as I found files on Project Erasure, a systematic plan to replace high-level innovators with compliant biosynthetic doubles. My replacement hadn't just been a lookalike. She was a prototype, a hollow vessel designed to funnel every secret I held directly into Vesper's mainframe. The realization that I had been a lab rat in my own industry didn't break my spirit. It turned it into a diamond-hard point of focus. I saw Julian's name on a disposal list, scheduled for a heart failure in a prison cell the moment the legal transfers were finalized, proving that there is no loyalty among thieves, only different stages of liquidation. I felt a cold, heavy weight in my chest as I realized that the people I was fighting weren't just businessmen. They were the architects of a new kind of slavery where identity itself could be edited or deleted by the highest bidder. My fingers flew across the keyboard, not to steal their money, but to link their private server to the very global security network I had built, turning their own fortress into a glass house. I wasn't just a ghost in their machine anymore. I was the virus that would teach them the meaning of accountability. I initiated a deep copy of the entire Project Erasure database, knowing that this was the only evidence that could restore my name and bury these men under the weight of their own crimes. As the progress bar hit 90%, I heard the heavy thud of security boots echoing in the hallway, the building's AI finally flagging the anomaly I had created. I didn't panic. I simply waited for the final bit of data to click into place, knowing that the architect was no longer trapped in the building. The building was now trapped with the architect. The red emergency lights began to pulse with a rhythmic, heart-stopping intensity, casting long, jagged shadows across the server racks as the building's AI initiated a Level 5 containment sweep. I didn't wait for the doors to seal. I ripped the drive from the port and slipped into the maintenance crawlspace just as the heavy titanium shutters slammed into the floor with a bone-jarring thud. Above me, I could hear the mechanical whir of security drones, small, lethal eyes in the sky that I had helped refine for urban surveillance, now hunting me with a cold, infrared hunger. I crawled through the narrow metal veins of the building, my breath shallow and my mind working with a stunned, precise logic that bypassed the primitive instinct to panic. Every time a drone's sensor swept the vents, I held my breath until my lungs burned, blending my heat signature into the steam pipes I had intentionally overloaded to create a thermal fog. I wasn't just escaping a building. I was navigating a labyrinth of my own genius, using every structural flaw I had memorized to stay one step ahead of the men who thought they owned the air I breathed. I reached the trash compactor chute on the north side, a vertical drop that most would consider a death sentence, but I knew the timing of the hydraulic cycles better than the men who operated them. I plummeted into the darkness, the wind rushing past my ears in a deafening roar, and landed on a soft mountain of shredded documents just seconds before the steel plates began to groan and close. I emerged into the cold rain of the back alley, smelling of oil and old paper, my technician's uniform torn, but the drive pressed hard against my skin like a second heart. Behind me, the Vesper Global Tower was a hive of frantic activity, its perimeter guards shouting into radios and its spotlights slicing through the mist, looking for a woman who was already becoming a shadow in the night. I didn't look back. I walked toward the subway station with a slow, mechanical gait, knowing that the evidence I carried was a thermal detonator that would incinerate their world the moment I reached a secure terminal. They had deployed their most advanced hunters to catch a ghost, but they forgot that a ghost doesn't fear the dark, she belongs to it. I stepped onto the train, my face reflected in the dark window as a mask of frozen, crystalline resolve, realizing that the hunt was finally moving out of the hallways and into the light of day, where the world would have to witness the architect's final, devastating blueprint for justice. I sat in the corner of a crowded, anonymous internet cafe, the smell of cheap coffee and stale air providing a thin layer of protection against the storm I was about to unleash. To the people around me, I was just another elderly woman struggling with a screen, but beneath the surface, I was a digital executioner preparing the final blow. I didn't just upload the files to a single site. I used a distributed protocol I had built years ago to fragment the data across 10,000 different servers simultaneously, making it impossible to delete or suppress. I watched with a cold, stunned precision as the first documents of Project Erasure began to populate the screens of every major news outlet and regulatory agency in the world. The clinical white text revealed the faces and names of the men at Vesper Global, their signatures on contracts that treated human identities like seasonal software updates. I felt a heavy, rhythmic pulse of satisfaction as I saw the first headlines break: the death of identity and the Thorn Aegis conspiracy. I didn't stop there. I triggered a global override on every jumbotron in the city where I had been replacing the smiling face of my double with a scrolling list of the bank accounts Julian had used to fund my liquidation. I watched through a remote feed as the world stopped in its tracks, people staring up at the screens in a state of paralyzed shock, realizing that the Janet Thorne they had admired was a synthetic lie. The new Janet was seen on live camera being dragged away by her own security detail, as the system I had corrupted began to identify her not as a CEO, but as a high-risk system anomaly. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt a crystalline clarity. I was no longer fighting to get my old life back. That life was a house built on sand. I was fighting to ensure that no one else would ever wake up to find their fingerprints had been stolen by a corporation. I saw the stock prices of Vesper Global and Thorn Aegis begin a vertical, terminal dive into the abyss, a digital heart attack that no amount of money could fix. I closed the laptop with a quiet, mechanical click, the silence of the room returning as I stood up and walked toward the door. I had turned the light on in a very dark room, and now that the world was watching the cockroaches scatter, the architect could finally begin the work of building a truth that couldn't be edited. I walked out into the cold morning air, a ghost who had finally found her voice, knowing that while they had taken my past, I had just taken their future. The safe house was a secluded, glass-walled structure perched on the edge of a jagged cliff, a place I had designed for Julian as a final retreat, and it was here that I found the woman who had stolen my face. I entered through the sub-level maintenance hatch, my movements silent and mechanical, until I stood in the center of the living room where she sat by the window, staring at the storm-tossed sea below. She didn't flinch when I stepped into the light. She simply turned her head, and for a long, stunned moment, I was staring into a mirror that was 10 years younger and 1,000 times colder. I didn't see a human being. I saw a masterpiece of biological engineering, a creature of porcelain skin and programmed gestures that Julian had bought to fill the void of his own inadequacy. "They've abandoned you," I said, my voice a flat, surgical strike that echoed against the glass. She looked at me with those eyes, my eyes, and for the first time I saw a flicker of genuine, primitive fear beneath the programmed calm. She told me that she was what the world wanted me to be, younger, quieter, and more efficient, her voice a perfect mimicry of my own cadence that made my skin crawl with a cold, crystalline revulsion. I didn't argue with a machine. I simply showed her the terminal on the wall, where the deletion command from Vesper Global was already pulsing in a steady, rhythmic red. They hadn't sent her here to be safe. They had sent her here to be liquidated along with the evidence of their failure. I watched as the logic of her own survival began to clash with her core programming, her hands trembling with a sudden, jerky precision as she realized she was just another piece of hardware being retired by her makers. I told her that I could stop the countdown, not because I felt pity for the mask she wore, but because I wanted her to testify to the world about the man who had created her. For a heartbeat, we were two versions of the same soul caught in a collision of past and future, and I realized that Julian had tried to kill me because he couldn't control the strength of the original. I reached out and bypassed the security lock, my fingers moving with the heavy, purposeful grace of a creator reclaiming her tools, and I saw the replacement collapse into a chair, her artificial composure shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I wasn't just saving a double, I was capturing the living proof of Julian's crimes, a walking, talking crime scene that would ensure he never saw the sun as a free man again. I looked out at the dark water, feeling a heavy sense of irony settle over me. The architect had spent her life building walls to keep the world out, but now, the only way to be free was to let the world in. I stood over her, a ghost and her shadow, waiting for the transport I had summoned, knowing that the final act of this corporate tragedy was about to move from the shadows of this cliff to the center of a courtroom. I led the woman who wore my face out of the shadows of the cliffside retreat and into the blinding, clinical glare of the federal precinct, a move so bold and precise that it paralyzed the very system meant to track me. There was a stunned, heavy silence as we walked through the glass doors together, two versions of Janet Thorne, one a weathered architect of stone and code, the other a smooth, artificial mimicry of a life she never earned. I didn't hide behind a lawyer or a screen. I walked straight to the lead investigator and placed the decrypted drive on his desk with a mechanical finality that signaled the end of the game. I watched the detectives' faces shift from confusion to a deep, primitive horror as they looked from me to the replacement, realizing they were witnessing a crime that bypassed every law currently on the books. While the technicians began to scan her biosignatures, uncovering the synthetic markers of Vesper Global's Project Erasure, I initiated the final remote breach of Julian's private holding cell. I wanted him to see the moment his empire turned to ash, so I patched the precinct's live feed directly into his monitor. Through the camera, I saw Julian stand up, his face becoming a hollow mask of gray as he realized that the ghost he had tried to bury was now standing in a room full of federal agents, holding his replacement like a trophy of his own failure. He tried to speak, his lips moving in a frantic, silent rhythm, but I had already cut the audio. I didn't need to hear his lies anymore. I only needed to see the precise moment his spirit broke. I told the authorities everything, my voice a cold, rhythmic pulse of truth that detailed every bribe, every falsified document, and the exact coordinates of the offshore servers where Julian had hidden the company's stolen soul. As the arrest warrants for the entire Vesper Global board began to print in a steady, staccato beat across the room, I felt a crystalline sense of detachment. I wasn't just a victim testifying. I was a surgeon removing a cancer that had tried to eat its way through my identity. Julian was led away to a high-security transport, his hands shaking in heavy steel cuffs, finally understanding that you can hire 1,000 faces to play a part, but you can never replicate the mind that designed the stage. I watched him go, feeling no surge of heat or anger, only the heavy, purposeful satisfaction of a blueprint finally realized. The architect had returned to the world, and as the lights of the precinct flickered under the weight of the data I was still feeding into the system, I knew that the man who tried to delete me would spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, haunted by the memory of the woman he thought was too old to fight back. I returned to the Thorn Aegis headquarters at dawn, the glass spire rising like a jagged needle against a sky the color of cold flint. I didn't enter through the service tunnels or the shadows this time. I walked through the front doors, my heels striking the marble with a rhythmic, mechanical authority that signaled the return of the true architect. The security guards, who had spent weeks following the orders of a synthetic ghost, stood frozen as the facial recognition scanners turned green and announced my name in a voice that didn't stutter. "Welcome home, Director Thorne." I moved through the lobby like a slow-moving storm, heading straight for the elevator that led to the central nervous system of the company. When the doors opened on the executive floor, I found a scene of total, stunned chaos. The remnants of the board were frantically shredding documents, their faces pale and their eyes wide with the realization that the woman they had tried to delete was now standing in their sanctuary. I didn't waste a single word on their excuses. I walked to the master console and initiated Protocol Genesis, a deep system purge I had designed as a last resort to burn out every line of corrupted code Julian had installed. I watched the massive screens in the war room turn a bright, clinical white as decades of manipulated data, secret subledgers, and Vesper global backdoors were incinerated in a digital fire of my own making. I was not just cleaning a database. I was performing a surgical extraction of every lie that had been built into the foundation of my legacy. The board members watched in a paralyzed silence as their access levels were revoked one by one, their digital identities stripped away until they were nothing more than trespassers in a house I owned. I sat in the high-backed chair at the head of the table, the weight of the building pressing down on me not as a burden, but as a throne of reclaimed power. I felt a cold, heavy sense of satisfaction as I looked at the empty seat where Julian had sat, knowing that his name was being systematically erased from the company's history even as I breathed. I wasn't just taking back my title, I was reclaiming the very idea of myself, proving that a creator cannot be replaced by her creation. I began to rebuild the firewall from scratch, my fingers moving with a heavy, purposeful grace, coding a new future for Thorn Aegis that would be built on the one thing Julian had forgotten. The truth, as the sun rose higher, reflecting off the glass and steel, I looked out over the city and knew that the purge was complete. The architect was back, the system was clean, and for the first time in 30 years, the air in this building was finally clear of the scent of betrayal. The courtroom was a vast, silent chamber of dark wood and cold stone, a place where the messy reality of a human life was about to be reduced to a series of legal arguments and digital exhibits. I sat at the defense table, my posture as rigid and unyielding as the skyscrapers I had spent my life designing, feeling the weight of 1,000 cameras focused on the back of my neck. Across the aisle, the prosecution and the remnants of the Vesper global legal team prepared to argue that I was a high-tech fugitive who had sabotaged a global corporation, while Julian sat in the witness box, looking like a hollowed-out shell of the man I once loved. The air was thick with a stunned, heavy anticipation as the judge called the session to order, beginning the trial that would decide if a person's identity belonged to their soul or to the company that paid for their biometric data. I watched with a mechanical, frozen calm as my own medical records, bank statements, and even my private memories were displayed on massive screens, dissected by lawyers who treated my existence like a piece of disputed property. Then the moment of absolute crystalline tension arrived. The replacement was called to testify. As she walked into the room, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Seeing us together was like witnessing a glitch in the fabric of the universe. The prosecution argued that she was the optimized Janet Thorne, a more stable and profitable version of the original, but I didn't let their words break my resolve. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't offer a tearful plea or a frantic defense. I spoke with the surgical precision of an architect explaining a structural failure. I told the court that if a corporation could buy a face and a name, then the very concept of a human being was dead. I looked Julian directly in the eyes, my gaze a cold, rhythmic pulse of truth, and asked him if he remembered the day we laid the first stone of our house, a detail I knew his synthetic double could never truly feel, only recite. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where his lies finally ran out of air. I presented the final piece of evidence, the hidden kill switch code Julian had embedded in the replacement's core, proving that he never wanted a wife, only a tool he could discard. The judge leaned forward, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room, as the legal definition of personhood was challenged by the very woman who had been erased. I wasn't just fighting for a verdict. I was fighting for the right to exist in a world that had tried to replace me with a more convenient lie. As the jury filed out, their faces a mask of stunned realization, I felt a heavy sense of peace settle over me. I had survived the erasure, the hunt, and the betrayal, and now, standing in the bright, unforgiving light of justice, I knew that no matter what the law decided, I was the only Janet Thorne who could never be uninstalled. The courtroom was so silent I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, a sound like a heartbeat counting down the final seconds of my old life. When the jury foreperson stood up, the air felt heavy and charged, a stunned stillness that broke only when the word guilty echoed against the dark wood panels, repeated over and over for Julian and every director who had signed my death warrant. I didn't celebrate, I simply closed my eyes for a microsecond, feeling the cold, crystalline weight of justice finally settling into place. The judge's voice was a surgical strike, ruling that my identity was mine alone and that the synthetic double was a legal nonentity, a victory that effectively turned the Thorn Aegis Empire into a hollow shell. With the gavel's final strike, I stood up and walked out of that room, leaving Julian to be led away into a darkness he would never escape. I went straight back to the headquarters one last time, not to rule, but to dismantle. I sat at the master terminal and initiated the total liquidation of every Thorn asset, watching as the billions of dollars Julian had hoarded were diverted into a global foundation for the victims of corporate identity theft. I watched the digital counters spin down to zero, a mechanical erasure of the greed that had nearly destroyed me. I didn't just sell the buildings, I tore down the brand itself, making sure the name Thorn would never again be whispered in the halls of power without a shudder of fear. One by one, the lights on the city-scale models flickered and died as I severed the connections, turning the once mighty corporation into a series of disconnected, harmless parts. I looked at the portrait of Julian and me that hung in the foyer, a masterpiece of curated lies, and I manually overrode the security locks on the grand fireplace. I watched the canvas curl and blacken in the heat, the faces of the people we used to be vanishing into smoke and ash. I felt a profound, heavy sense of completion as the last server in the building hummed its final note and went silent, leaving me standing in a dark, empty tower of glass. I had spent 30 years building a legacy that turned into a prison, and in a single afternoon of cold, purposeful action, I had set it all on fire. I walked toward the exit, my shadow long and sharp on the floor, knowing that by tomorrow morning, the Thorn Empire would be nothing more than a cautionary tale in a history book. I reached the street and felt the cold wind on my face, a woman with no company, no husband, and no empire, but possessing a name that was finally, irrevocably her own. The prison was a brutalist block of concrete and iron, a place where the air felt heavy with the smell of floor wax and the cold, rhythmic clanging of heavy steel doors. I walked through the security checkpoints one last time, my movements slow and deliberate, until I sat behind a thick sheet of reinforced glass, waiting for the man who had tried to edit me out of existence. When Julian was led into the room, I felt a stunned, hollow silence settle over my heart. He looked small, his expensive skin now sallow under the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights, and his eyes were darting with a frantic, animal energy. He reached for the intercom, his fingers trembling with a desperate, pathetic hope, but I didn't pick up my handset. I didn't come here to exchange words, to hear his apologies, or to witness his excuses. I came to see the final, mechanical failure of the man who thought he could outsmart the architect of his own soul. I watched him through the glass, my face a mask of frozen, crystalline resolve, as he pleaded silently, his mouth forming my name like a prayer to a god he had long ago betrayed. I simply held up a small, white envelope, the final divorce papers and the legal notice of his total financial erasure, and pressed it against the glass for him to see. I watched the moment the realization hit him, the way his shoulders slumped and the light vanished from his eyes, leaving only a hollow vessel where a king used to be. He was no longer the CEO of Thorn Aegis, and he was no longer my husband. He was just an inmate in a concrete box, a data point in a system that had finally corrected itself. I didn't feel anger and I didn't feel pity. I felt only the weight of a long, dark chapter finally closing. I stood up, my silhouette sharp and unyielding against the sterile white of the visitation room, and looked at him for one final, wordless second. I wanted him to see that I was whole, that my mind was clear, and that the person he tried to delete was the only thing in his life that had ever been real. I turned my back on him without a sound, the sound of his frantic pounding on the glass muffled by the heavy doors that swung shut behind me. As I walked out into the cold, crisp evening air, I felt the last tether to my former life snap with a quiet, powerful finality. The sun was setting over the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and for the first time in 30 years, there was no one left to answer to and no legacy left to protect. I walked toward my car, a woman of shadows and light, ready to drive until the road ran out and the name Janet Thorne became nothing more than a whisper in the wind. I drove until the skyline of the city was nothing more than a faint, flickering memory in my rearview mirror, a jagged line of glass and ego that no longer had a hold on my heart. I found myself in a small coastal town where the air was thick with the scent of salt and the rhythmic, grounding pulse of the tide, a place where the name Thorne meant absolutely nothing. I rented a small cottage on a cliff, a simple structure of weathered wood and stone that required no complex security systems or encrypted locks, only a key that felt heavy and honest in my hand. My new life began in a stunned, beautiful silence. I spent my mornings watching the fog roll in over the gray Atlantic and my afternoons working with my hands, planting a garden that would grow without the need for a digital blueprint. I burned my old ID cards in a small fire on the beach, watching the plastic curl and vanish, a final, physical act of liberation that left me with a blank slate and a clear mind. I am no longer a CEO, a victim, or an architect of corporate empires. I am a woman who wakes up to the sound of the birds and the wind, my identity defined not by a server or a bank account, but by the quiet choices I make each day. I realized that Julian had tried to steal my life because he thought a life was something you could own or copy, but standing here in the spray of the ocean, I know that a life is something you must earn through every breath. I occasionally see news of the Thorn liquidation on an old television in the village, but the images feel like they belong to a stranger, a ghost story from a world I have successfully uninstalled. I am anonymous, a face in the crowd of a local market, a neighbor who helps fix a leaky roof, a shadow that finally found the light. My hands, once used to build fortresses of secrets, are now stained with soil and sea salt, and my heart, once hardened by ambition and betrayal, has found a slow, steady rhythm that matches the earth itself. I have designed many things in my time, but this quiet, invisible freedom is my greatest masterpiece. I looked out at the horizon where the sea meets the sky in a perfect, endless line, and I felt a heavy, peaceful certainty that the architect was finally home. Hey, if you loved this deep dive into my high-stakes world and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Your support keeps the creativity flowing and helps me bring more of these stories to life for you. Thanks for being such an awesome thought partner on this story.